Hey, everybody, welcome to Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. My guest today is Seth Miller. And when you get a text intro to somebody from a friend of yours that says, you need to meet my mad scientist buddy, the answer is always yes. And so I said yes. So welcome on, Seth.
Thank Chuck. Thank you for having me. Happy to be mad, if not terribly angry. We'll see how it goes.
Perfect. Well, tell the audience real
Yeah.
quick your background, because I don't think I can do it justice. We talked the other day on the phone, and I think you said everything but professional race car driver, but maybe you're holding that back on me.
No, I promise you, there's nothing held back. So you guys talk a lot about the intersection between energy and finance on this show, and there's a lot of interest in technology, right? I come at things from a technology perspective. So I got a PhD in chemistry back 25 years ago. And I started out actually in Dallas in the semiconductor industry working for Texas Instruments. My wife grew up in Colorado. She convinced me to move out here. And at the end of 2008, I found myself in the Great Recession after having left a startup. And well, technically, they let go. They made the step to let go of me. I had to figure out what to do with my life, and I became a consultant. And so, like a lot of consultants, it's really hard to have a simple story about what I do. But there are three pieces. One is I do technology consulting around especially batteries, but also other areas in renewable energy. The second is I do innovation consulting, helping folks figure out how to deploy their innovation dollars, innovation investments towards building new technologies. And then the third, I guess I'll just sort of throw into translation. And that's like doing diligence for venture capitalists, working with attorneys, trying to help make sure that people understand technology and are able to sort of make rational decisions based on what's actually going on the ground. So that's where my interests are. I do a lot of inventing and patenting, and I think that's where the mad scientist thing comes from. But mostly I'm just a technologist who happens to like finance and energy stuff on the side.
Oh, that's cool. So you were kind enough to send me an article you had written about climate change and maybe a framework for how to think about it and how to study it and say, is it actually happening? Is it not happening? We don't have to read the whole article
Yeah.
out loud, but do you mind kind of just summarizing a bit? Because when I was going through it, I maybe level set for the audience because I had some questions. I found it really fascinating and very constructive.
Well, cool. First, I'm glad you like it, and this was inspired by the fact that back this is I wrote this in 2016. I was doing quite a bit of blogging back then, and I was unsatisfied with the idea that because 97% of climate scientists believed in global warming, that we should just listen to them, right? I'm not really great with listening to authority, generally speaking. A lot of inventors have that character trait.
I
And
love that.
yeah, and so pushing back on that, trying to scratch at that, what is it exactly? Because look, I'm a scientist. I know A, that scientists can be wrong, and B, that frankly, entire fields of science can sometimes wander off of the edge, right? There was a story that I wrote just prior to this one about how physics and astronomy at the turn of the last century, so the end of the 1900s, beginning of the 2000s, I'm sorry, end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, we honestly thought that there were a lot of respectable physicists thought there were canals on the moon, like channels on the moon. And I'm sorry, on Mars, my apologies, channels on Mars. And the idea that the challenge was that they were looking into telescopes and they were looking in the same kind of telescopes at the same resolution. The channels that folks saw, and they really did see these things, turned out to be optical illusions that had a lot to do with the exact magnification of those telescopes. And folks later figured out where the errors were. But when everyone is using the same tool, um, folks can go down the wrong path. So science can do that. How do we know they're not doing that with global warming? I wanted to have a better understanding of how to address that question than just listening to scientists. And so I started to dig in.
Because one of the points you made that I've always had the question of, and maybe level setting from my side, I always think that the observation ought to be able to be seen by a whole lot of people in the data, right? Just
Yeah.
we all know that the apple fell out of the tree. Now we need Newton to tell us about gravity, and that's why. So I'm all for scientists explaining it why. And when I've looked at the data on climate change, I saw something that you brought up in your article, so I'll lay it out there. Is yes, it looks like temperatures have risen, call it a degree and a half, 2 degrees since 1850, but it also looks like CO2 has risen, but CO2 is rising in front of temperature.
Yeah.
And to me, an observation is I have a cold Coca-Cola sitting there in ice, and as it warms up over time, it gets flat, right? The
Right.
CO2 bubbles out. So I've always kind of said, how are we not sure CO2 is first? Temperature is first and CO2 follows versus what we think today is CO2 up, therefore temperature's up.
Yeah. So like this is actually a great question, and because if you look at the history of the data, if you go back a century or so, what you'll find in the data is that as CO2 started to rise, temperature was actually rising before CO2 did, and they didn't cross over until I think it was maybe the 70s, I think, where you start to really see CO2 rising and outstripping the temperature gains, and it looks more like CO2 came first. And, that is a significant challenge that you have to be willing to reckon with. Now, there's a longer answer and a shorter answer to that one. And I'll give you the shorter answer, which is that when the CO2 was rising in the 1920s and 1930s, and we first started to have combustion engines and whatnot, it wasn't rising at an incredibly high rate. And so the natural variability of temperature was greater than the forcing from the climate that CO2 was creating. Starting in the 1970s, those things flipped, right? The forcing and that humans would create ends up outstripping the natural variability. So it's not nuts to see something like this. We should be pretty rigorous and make sure that we're doing things logically. But it on its own isn't enough to be able to say one way or the other. We need to look at a broader set of data, right?
So and now I'm going to go in a weird, different direction, but this is fascinating to me, and I appreciate you humoring me. How good is our actual data? Because when I go back and read about data, and I have not deep dived it, so I should not be held out as an expert in any way, shape, or
Yeah.
form, but you hear about how back in 1930 we took temperatures at 50 miles at sea, and now we
Right.
take it at land. We used to take it, the airports, we moved them out to the airports where there's more concrete, maybe it's warmer. Do we have confidence even that we're looking at good data, or do we know?
Oh, we have very good data. So let me back up a second and
Okay.
say, look, and I want to let the audience know. So my background is a chemist. I'm not a climate scientist full time. I do a lot of science communication, and so a lot of what I'm doing is pulling in strands of evidence that are coming from lots of different fields, right? And again, we have lots of different strands. So very specifically in the article that I wrote, I talk about something called Hill's criteria, which is a set of criteria that we use to assess whether or not we understand something. There are 9 of them. We'll talk a little bit about what each of those are. But the type of criteria that you're talking about are things like consistency, right? So we see a temperature change on a mountain in Hawaii, for example. That's one piece of data. But also, we see a seasonal change. We see the growing season lengthen in the US. We see the growing season lengthen in Japan. We can see evidence of migration of animals. So there's not just a single temperature measurement that we're relying on. There needs to be some sort of consilience of all of these different strands before we actually start to all converge on the same source conclusion. So yes, there is a dramatic amount of evidence. It's literally all over the map. It comes from climate scientists, but it will come from folks in a lot of different fields. And all of it points at the same direction that, yeah, that the Earth's warming. There's pretty much no doubt about it.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, fair enough. I had read someplace, and for all I know, it was off Twitter, so it may be 100% garbage. But I'd read if you looked back kind of over time and you looked at what I'll call the extrapolation of data, i.e., we used to rate, take the temperature at 10 in the morning. Now we do it 2 in the afternoon, and an adjustment factor is add a degree and a half or whatever. Any
Right.
time we kind of manipulated data to corresponding to changes in methodology that versus just a raw temperature reading that had been consistent over time, we actually find that most of the rising is attributed to the interpolated data and not the raw data. And my point about that is not that global warming isn't happening. It could be way worse than we think, because who knows if the interpolations are right. But,
Yeah,
you
I mean,
know,
if your data sucks, I mean, you should always, always, always look and challenge to see whether or not the data is robust, right? Like, I'm totally in favor of that. And there are like when I wrote this article, I can't remember what the number was, but it was well over 100 independently measured strands of data. The independence is huge. You don't want there to be a change in protocol which affects all of your measurements at the same time, right? It's like you change the CPI and now like, you don't look at things the same way anymore. You have to recognize and write that down. You want there to be independence of these things. And again, this is kind of like, it's not just guys with thermometers. It is farmers. It is, zoologists, plant biologists. It's guys in Antarctica and guys in Hawaii. This is where that famous 97% number starts to come from, is that you do a Google Scholar search and you put in climate change in quotes and you look at the conclusion. You have some poor graduate student look at the conclusion of all of the papers and classify them. And that's how you end up with these kinds of 97% numbers. But it's every field, everyone working at the same time is coming independently, right?
yeah.
And it doesn't matter what country, it doesn't matter what their grant funding source was. They're all looking at different sets of data and coming to the same conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha. So if you were kind of summarizing your article and your thoughts on it, and I'm curious, and I'm
Yeah.
just because I haven't studied this as much as I should. I always say on the podcast, we ignore this phenomenon at our own peril. That being said, I just don't know how much certainty we have around the link to kind of man-made hydrocarbon burning leading to the actual increase
Yeah.
in temperature. Do you have kind of an opinion on where that shakes out? Because you're a lot smarter than I am.
I am certainly a guy who spends time thinking about this stuff more than I get paid for, more than I should.
I
I mean, look,
always say my podcast is my nonprofit endeavor, so I
yeah, no,
agree. I understand.
blogging is the same way. I don't do this because I want to make money writing. I am happy when it gets read. And this blog post has been used. Like I know somebody who's using it to teach classes at Columbia University, right? I mean, I was very happy with the response to it. But I'm doing this because I believe that this matters, right? And I believe that looking at this rigorously and rationally matters, and skeptically and carefully, all that stuff. I'm a technologist and a scientist, but also like the way to think about this as an actuary, like this is insurance. This is what we're talking about here. And so one way to interpret your question is like, what's the insurance premium that we would want to pay against a future of climate change, right? So there is a term of art in the environmental world called the social cost of carbon. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
Yeah.
It's, and it, even in the name is kind of airy fairy. The derivation is hard and subject to some error. But the point of it is that, hey, we're adding carbon to the atmosphere. There is, if you look at the IPCC reports, there's an estimated answer as to what the forcing is because of this carbon. There's error bars, right? The error bars all more or less tell you something's going to happen when you add the CO2 to the atmosphere. How much is not always clear. So making a 2050 prediction is hard. but we have error bars. An actuary knows what to do with that. They can calculate a premium. If you think about what the costs are to human health, the costs are to lost real estate if you happen to live in Miami or in Jakarta, anywhere in the world. Most of our real estate is on coastal lands, and a lot of that's going to be imperiled by climate change, by rising oceans. That's the classic answer. But of course, there are effects on crops, and there are fires in Colorado and Canada because of this. And the smoke causes health damages, and it goes on. The number that the best science comes up with right now is $190 a ton, is what the estimate is. Now, the government is using a number closer to $50 a ton when it's officially assessing damage. But the best science analysis number is about $190. That's an extraordinary amount of money when we start talking about multiple gigatons of CO2 that we are releasing every year. So billions of tons of CO2 every year, tens of billions of CO2 every year, at the cost of $190 per ton, right? So I think the number is on the range of somewhere between 40 and 50 billion is what society combusts every year. So yeah, you start to get up into trillions of dollars of cost per year, and that effectively we're spending this, that is a cost into the future. There's a discount rate. It's not like you got to think about this further, but yeah, it strikes me that's all about right, honestly.
Yeah. So you're the technologist. I have an opinion, so I'll just say it, and
Yeah.
you can tell me you're an idiot or take it wherever you want to go. My sense is that we have a fixed amount of money. That's just kind of life. Unfortunately, my kids have a budget. They can, their allowance, they can spend that. I'm unemployed. There's only so much money around the Yates house that we can spend. And the world is that way. I don't know that we have the technologies available today to really do anything material against carbon being spewed out to make that much of a difference. So with my limited money, I'm looking for next generation technologies to do something about this. Or is your sense we have this to do today? Because I think at the end of the day, our discussion should really be about, kind of the water balloon. We push here, this side pops out. How should we be going about dealing with this carbon issue?
Yeah. So, I mean, the dumb answer is why not both? I mean, yeah, we have limited resources, but you spend a little bit on today and a little bit on tomorrow. The idea that you have that we should invest in long-term technology is, I'm 100% aligned with that. And look, from a political standpoint, if we just ignore all of the theory stuff and say, hey, if we make people's lives materially worse, they are going to vote us out of office. So stop it, right? I'm a big fan of simplifying assumptions, and that one gets you to, I would like to make people have cheaper energy. And if I can get solar and wind as great examples, cheaper than coal and natural gas, then everybody wins. So let's invest in trying to make those technologies better for everybody. I can make a good argument that EVs are just better vehicles than combustion engine vehicles. We can get into arguments about it, but they got a little bit of pickup.
I drove a Tesla for 6 years. It was an amazing car.
They are.
I mean, 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds. That computer screen was amazing.
Yes.
The fact that I could push a button and have any seat make a fart noise to embarrass my kids was priceless.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know how much you pay for that, for the fart noise. Is that a standard option?
It was a free download that came with the $145,000 Model X that I owned, that I bought 7-8 years ago.
I just want to say the technology is great.
Yeah.
Look, the other thing about EVs is that we frankly already passed the point where the long-term total cost of ownership of EVs is lower than internal combustion engine because EVs famously have far fewer parts. You don't have all of these mechanical failures in EVs that you do in internal combustion engine vehicles. So while the sticker price of EVs is higher, the total cost of ownership, when you include the fact that electricity is cheaper than gasoline and the repair costs long-term for these EVs are going to be lower, you have a good value for the customer. And that's just going to get better as we scale these technologies and cost reduce them further. That's a great platform for a lot of the problem. It doesn't solve everything, right? If you look,
And let me cut you off
yeah,
real quick to throw one fact at you, because I'm totally okay with letting the market compete. And, if it ultimately is true, or I always think economics win out. Volvo did a deep dive. It's on their website. It's 150 pages long.
yeah,
It put me to sleep 3 times, but I have made it all the way through it. And we can fight about all the assumptions they made. But at the end of the day, they kind of have the breakover point for an internal combustion engine carbon footprint and an EV carbon footprint at anywhere from kind of 70 to I think 90,000 kilometers,
right,
which look, most cars are on the road 150,000, 200,000 miles because they all wind up in
right,
Latin America. We always joke that the greatest advertisement for a Toyota truck is the fact that, anytime you see anybody in the Middle East driving an old car, it's a Toyota truck.
right.
But at the end of the day, we're going to spend trillions of dollars to convert to internal combustion engines. I mean, to convert to EVs with charging stations, et cetera.
Yeah,
Is that really worth the money to do?
yeah.
Or should we be investing that money elsewhere?
All right. So I'm going to break this up into two parts.
Okay, fair
The
enough.
first is, okay, so 70 to 90,000 kilometers, we'll call that 80,000 kilometers, which is 50,000 miles. So if you have a turning point in costs at 50,000 miles, then yeah, you're better off with a battery electric vehicle if that battery electric vehicle costs as much as an internal combustion engine. So that's actually not inconsistent with my idea that, hey, battery electric vehicles are more expensive today, but they will be longer term cheaper over the lifetime of that vehicle. Totally consistent with what Volvo reported. Now, when you get into the details of what Volvo's assumptions are, the numbers that I've heard from other folks who have, I don't know, long physicist beards and teach academic stuff, their numbers are in the 30,000 mile kind of number. They get to assume a future grid, which is greener. They get to assume a future battery supply chain, which is greener. And those things are probably not wrong. But whether it's 30 or 50, I don't know if I care. Bottom line is that, yeah, total cost of ownership is going to be lower, right? That's number one. Now, the second one, and this one I know you're going to love. There are other mitigating factors, new technologies that are going to arrive. And everybody's favorite punching bag for technologies that haven't arrived right now is self-driving vehicles, right? Elon Musk being the classic example of somebody that hasn't delivered, right? He's been promising for a long time. Self-driving turns out to be really hard. It's being done in San Francisco right now. There are limited pilots, but it's happening slower than everybody predicted. Having said that, if you are an environmentalist, what you want more than anything in the world is a self-driving car, because a self-driving car changes the business model of driving from one of home individual ownership of a vehicle to a different one, which is transportation as a service. And when you move to transportation as a service, now the economics of a business matter. And they are very used to an amortization curve and figuring out what the lowest TCO is and minimizing their long-term costs. If we get self-driving vehicles, they'll all be electric, every single one of them.
So
Right.
I will give you that point, and I'll even make your case for you as I'm ducking my oil and gas guys taking shots at me. But if we just didn't accelerate at every green light, like we were 17 years old driving a car for the first time, that would do a lot. And so having automated driving, we will not be accelerating, and even if
Right.
you have an internal combustion engine, if you're slotted in the auto drive cars, you're going to
Right.
drive more rationally. So I'll give you that point. The pushback I have on just EVs is we're going to spend trillions in creating charging stations. We're going to have
Right.
more road repair work because EVs are heavier than normal vehicles.
Yep.
And I have not done this math except after 2 bottles of wine. So take that with a grain of
Yeah, this is
salt.
definitely a 2 bottle of wine kind of conversation,
T-
even though technically it's mid-afternoon for both of us right
yes,
now.
and I've been drinking water. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but but I honestly think to get all the rare earth metals that you're going to need to have all of these electric vehicles and such, that stuff's in the middle of nowhere. You're running that off diesel. And a lot of the parts in the electric vehicles are plastic made of petroleum products. I'm not sure we've really minimized the amount of
Right.
combustion that happens by going to electric vehicles. And we haven't even touched
Yeah.
disposing of these batteries yet,
All right. So hear me out. The
Okay.
future,
Yeah.
so if you try to look at the intersection of these technologies, and that's sort of what I do for a living, is think about again how to deploy technology investment dollars, what technologies are going to be coming down the future, how is that going to intersect with your technology, what's going to substitute for what. If I can substitute home ownership with a vehicle that I can summon on demand, my capex utilization for my car in my garage is 6%, 4%. I don't even commute. I work in my freaking basement, right? This is hello, right? I barely use this vehicle. And it is dumb at some level for me to go mine all that lithium and nickel and cobalt and put it inside of a metal box inside of a bigger box inside my house, right? That's not very intelligent efficient utilization. If I had the ability to just summon a vehicle and it was economically competitive to do so, then this would be a solution because we would need 10x fewer or 10% of the vehicles, 10% of the batteries. So less sheet metal, less lithium, less nickel, less cobalt, right? That's
Okay.
the best. That's the best answer that we can have. A lot of the environmentalists who I know who are very much in favor of transforming the economy in other ways, they get a little bit itchy about self-driving vehicles and about those kinds of societal changes. But the software issues around what software allows you to do is efficiently use resources, right? At the end of the day, that's what all the software revolution is about. If we push that forward and we were a little bit more aggressive in encouraging and allowing self-driving vehicles, it would have huge knock-on effects for the transportation sector and for carbon.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I'll get that. I'll get that, and I actually I'll buy into that. I don't know two things, and I think 5 to 10 years ago I would have made this first point very passionately. Now I will make it very meekly, kind of
Okay.
post pandemic. 10 years ago, nobody on the planet wants a self driving car. They want to drive a car because the whole reason to have a car is so you can woo beautiful women. And,
Right.
you don't want a self driving car doing whatever. I don't know. I've softened up on our
Yeah.
ability, on our resolve to remain independent here. So I think that's kind of one
Yeah.
issue. The second, it's going to be fascinating to watch the regulatory environment try to sort all this out because at the end of the day, who's responsible for what when a wreck happens? I actually think that's way more the limiting factor than the actual technology.
Yeah, which is to say that as a society, we have some say in this, right? We could, as a society, decide to allow this to happen faster or slower. And we will make that decision. I would like to see some competition between societies. I want someone out there to I don't know, to be captured by the automotive apparatus and allow this. I mean, this is I want somebody to do the experiment. the sad truth of the matter is that very much U.S. regulatory structure gets mimicked worldwide, and so folks, you do not have the situation where like the Singaporean government is like, woohoo, let's get ahead and allow this first. Although you would think of all countries in the world, Singapore is like really well placed to be like, here's what the rules are going to be, guys, and we're going to do this first, and it's going to make not just personal transportation cheaper and better, but also, I mean, like, okay, deep breath. We forget about buried pipes. We forget about infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure. You're an oil and gas guy, so maybe you haven't forgotten the way that other people have. But one of the biggest barriers to economies of scale is having to physically co-locate different pieces of manufacturing equipment, right? If you had self-driving vehicles, effectively robots that can go from business to business and take a load from one machine to another and be able to allow what's effectively an API call in the physical world, if you would, that would be kind of cool, right? That would kind of be revolutionary for the cost of building things. We can't do it because it costs too much to pay a Teamster to take the load. If it's all automated, you get some other benefits. So there's all of this knock-on effects that you get from making a core transportation or distribution technology cheaper that are phenomenal. And I'm 100% of the belief that, yeah, as much as cars are sex and whatnot, the kids aren't having sex today anyway. So apparently that's not going to save it.
Thank goodness. I have 3 daughters, so I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I worry a little bit, but nobody's leaving the house. And I'm pretty sure that's a precursor to actually meeting somebody. If it's cheaper, it'll happen. Self-driving cars would be cheaper. It would be cheaper than owning a new car in your own garage with the cost of insurance and car payments and maintenance and gasoline, right? So the value prop is potentially there for society. I would love to see us double down. I'm a minority opinion here. I'm fine with that, right?
Yeah.
But going back, core principles from my perspective as an environmentalist / technology guy, make people's lives better, and they will welcome the change. Invest in the technologies that will make their lives better. Give them more and cheaper energy. Give them more and cheaper transportation, and you will see them switch over to the things that you want. But if all you can do is tell people that they're bad if they don't change, they will just get angry. And I'm not as interested in that.
And I think when you and I were talking the other day, I think I said kind of the same thing, but just in a little bit of a different way. If our solution to climate change from Europe and the United States to China, India, and where the vast majority of the future population is coming from, Africa, if our solution to climate change is let them eat cake,
Yeah.
you need to suffer with more expensive energy or whatever. I just think that's going to be fundamentally really bad.
Yeah.
Bad things will happen.
The history of the environmentalist movement has been to say no to things, right? That's been like, we are going to try to throw as much debris as possible into the gears of capitalism in order to be able to slow it down so we stop polluting, right? Now the perspective is a little bit different. Now we have solar technologies, things that are green. The Greens, some of the Greens are like, hey, actually, like this whole building permit thing, haha, just kidding. We now are against building permits. We're now against permitting problems also. We want this sped up, right? And I'm in that camp where I'm like, oh yeah, no, like build things, right? Everybody should build. But there's a real philosophical break inside of the environmentalist movement between folks like me who are like, build more faster, just do it green this time, and folks who are like, no, we have to stop capitalism.
Yeah.
Right. And
no, I actually don't think we're that far apart. I think where we would get potentially far apart is how much are we willing to use the stick of the government?
Oh
And
yeah. 100
you know,
Tariff. It's
I'm
tariffs.
very much a libertarian and let markets play out where they may. And I also have this strain, and this is my British girlfriend hates this, but I have this unbridled belief that when a crisis happens, nobody steps up and deals with it like the United States. So if we really are dramatically changing the planet, at some point we'll get our act together, we'll step up, we'll handle the crisis. So I sleep well at night, letting the market just do what it wants to do.
But
But
but us handling the crisis is the government getting involved. Like that's exactly what it looks like. This thing, this is actually happening, right? The, I would love it if we could have a carbon tax and get everybody the hell out of the way. Like I would totally, a carbon tax is like there was a period of time where Republicans, this was maybe 25 years ago, the idea of a flat tax. Do you remember that
oh yeah,
conversation?
yeah,
And hey, we're going to get rid of the income tax and we're going to put in a value added tax or something like that. And a carbon tax is a VAT, right? A carbon tax is a flat tax, but it's on carbon instead of on dollars. It's
yeah.
the same thing. I would love for a world that would allow us to converge on that as a solution. It does not appear to be this world. Maybe in a different simulation, we could have that. Um,
So I will make ground here. I will actually agree with you on that. I because even if you are 100% don't believe in climate change, that it's natural, CO2 does pollute. I mean, you just have to go to a big city with a bunch of cars running around. There is some pollution there.
right.
So it does have a cost. I mean, my two issues with the carbon tax is one, I'm not for unilateral disarmament. So if China and India aren't
Yeah.
signing up for this, you know, it
That,
doesn't
and
really
that's
help us.
fair, right?
And two, I just hate the slippery slope nature of it. It's carbon tax, it goes here, it goes there, but
Yeah, yeah. If I can give you a reduction on your income tax and we're going to charge it to you as carbon tax and we'll be I mean, there are ways to frame this. There are solutions to these problems. As it stands, we've gone a different route. We've done the Inflation Reduction Act, and we are going to spend, I don't know, trillion-ish, 2 trillion. I'm not sure what the latest numbers are on green technologies, and some of it's going to be wasted. And I know it's terrifying.
yeah.
Some of it's going to be spent on technologies that didn't work. It's not efficient, but also probably almost certainly better than not. And so that seems to be the way that we're doing it. It's we are weirdly paying down our future carbon bills by creating loans which our descendants will have to pay down instead. But if the cost of those interest payments and loans are lower than the cost of the carbon, then I guess that's okay. So the math works, and I'm not going to be like a philosopher. It's like, dude, whatever works. Let's just get this. Let's get this started. And again, we're gonna, for a lot of this stuff, we're gonna make people's lives better by doing it. That's the
Yeah.
hope.
So I'm going to totally kind of close this segment,
Yeah.
if you will, with a question. I have been so vastly impressed by you, and I have been
Aw.
conferred the honor of bestowing upon you energy czar of the world. So
Okay.
whatever you say goes.
Oh, good
We
Lord.
all have to listen to it. We all have to do it. Give me kind of the plan, the bullet point version of the plan you put in place to get us where you want to go.
Do I get to have a beer first? I
Sure,
feel
you can
like
have a
I feel like
you
this
can
is
have a
hard.
beer.
Oh
You
my
can
gosh.
have two
All right.
bottles of wine, whatever. But putting you in charge, what are the two or three things you're doing?
All right. So, as energy czar of the world, I feel compelled to give this a total of about 28 seconds of reflection.
Perfect.
Yeah, that seems about right. What do we do? You know, the way that I look at this is that there's a cost of carbon now. The damage from CO2 adds over time. So if I release a CO2 molecule today and it absorbs light and it absorbs infrared and doesn't allow it to escape and re-emits it to the ground. That's how this process works. And as long as that CO2 molecule is there, it's going to keep doing that with new photons. So it's integrating, right? You want to, you want to do as much as you can right now. At the same time, you also are going to be accelerating exponentially your capabilities going forward. So you got to invest in both, right? And so, if I were the czar, yeah, a carbon tax is probably the most economically efficient. I would figure out a way to make people want to tax the tax as a solution. I'm not sure how I do that. I mean, look, like soda is bad.
Hypnosis may be the way. I
Yeah,
don't know.
you would think with all of the attention that people give to 5G and mind control, we would have a solution to this, and yet we fail. The like we can't even do a soda tax and make it stick. Like France can't even do a soda tax and make it stick. Like we are literally killing ourselves with sugar. There is no, like, people do not argue about this. It tastes good though, so please get out of my way. And so this human nature is hard. But I would want there to be a carbon tax. I would want to set a price of carbon. I would want to set it low at first. I would want to slowly raise it. It's going to take time to establish accounting methods, and you have to be realistic about the pace. I do not want to see us move so quickly that we accidentally move into a crisis of energy shortage. I do not want people to die because they are shivering in the winter or they can't get cool in the summer because we moved too quickly. So I want to be responsible about it. But
And let me cut you
yeah,
off and just say to oil and gas folks that are listening to that, that's a true belief you have, because we talked about that the other day, and that was one of the things I was going to bring up.
yeah,
Is you I think are very pragmatic about it in terms of what we were talking about the other day of, hey, we
yeah,
can't cause death today, and oh, by the way, we're actually going to have to be intellectually honest that we go to solar and wind. We don't have dispatchable power like we do today if we replace, and we've got to be honest and navigate those treacherous waters too. So I thought you
yeah.
were really fair on that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you just straight up, like I hang out with climate activists who hate the fact that we're going to be having to build a lot of new gas plants capacity, in order to turn on and off quickly, in order to be able to match the high solar and wind loadings that we're going to have, and that last 20% of electricity we just don't have an answer for. Um, and that's real, and we should respect that reality while trying to invest in solutions that will get around it. Um, but yeah, having said all of that, look, where does the CO2 come from? It comes from the electricity sector, so you shut down coal, and that's happening. It comes from burning natural gas, and most of the baseload natural gas is probably going to go away on its own because it's not going to be long-term cost competitive with solar and wind. But that last 20%, I don't got a solution for, and that's going to be gas, right? Until we have an alternative. I would, obviously move from internal combustion engine to EVs, and I would ideally do it as self-driving cars because they will have less of a resource requirement, and again, they'll make people's lives better when you do it. You can still keep your car, your Aston Martin from 1968 in your garage or whatever, and go to the mountains fine. I don't care, right? Like, I don't want this to be everything. This isn't about regulating everybody's individual behavior. This is about giving people options that don't create this long-term debt overhang in terms of climate. By the way, 20% of the problem is agriculture and land use and of CO2 emissions. A lot of that comes to deforestation in Brazil. So yeah, as czar, I'm also trying to figure out ways to incentivize folks in the global south to stop cutting down trees. And that is really hard because now the problem is that, the job of a cow is to monetize land. And the reason why people chop down those trees is because the trees aren't monetizing the land. And so figuring out how to get people money to stop that without incentivizing weird behaviors is hard. But I think about it. You know, there's the rest of it ends up being a lot of software. Like I'll give you an example of a way we can do things smarter. Steel right now, we has a huge concrete footprint. Carbon footprint. When we make steel, it's something like 7 or 8% of global CO2 emissions is basically steel, or steel and concrete. So these infrastructure projects are a big deal. And the concrete emits carbon dioxide not just from having to heat it, but chemically. You take calcium carbonate and you turn it to calcium oxide, and carbon dioxide comes out. Figuring out ways to use these things more intelligently is important. If you had the ability when you took down a building to take the I-beams and inspect them and put them somewhere so that you could use those same I-beams when you designed a new building, that would be kind of clever. And that's in principle possible with better software, but in practice too hard for us right now. But it seems kind of within reach. So there's all sorts of other little things that I would just figure out ways to incentivize.
So I will give you my thing. If I am made energy czar of the world, my first priority, I'm going to spend 500 billion incentivizing whales to have sex, because
Oh yeah,
have you heard?
100% in favor of sexy whales.
Because so I'll start and you take over, because you probably actually know the real facts. I don't. But you look back 200, 250 years ago, we had 4 to 5 million whales on the planet. Today we got about 1.4 million they talk about, and it's because we were killing whales for oil, as well as nowadays we hit them with ships. Baby whales are curious about a ship. And if you look at a whale, when it dies, it has on average, I think, 33 tons of CO2 in it. It sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and we don't see that CO2 again for years.
Right.
But more importantly, the greatest source of getting rid of CO2 is, I think it's plankton is 40% of the photosynthesis that happens on the planet. And so the greatest environment for plankton is whale shit. And so I want more whales out there.
So I'm 100% aligned with you. So let me tell you a story. So one of the blog posts that I wrote was on what happened to the whales. Do you know why we killed the whales? What we used that oil for?
I mean, blubber, right? To light lamps so we could read at night.
We solved the blubber problem in the late 1800s. It was first coal oil and then obviously petroleum, right? Much better than whale blubber. It was margarine.
Really?
We killed them to make margarine.
No way.
We killed the whales. We rendered them in because whale blubber was slightly less expensive than these things like safflower oil and cottonseed oil and such that was relatively new. We didn't have an agricultural system. We had a rapidly industrializing world. We didn't have enough butter. Margarine was cheaper, and the big damage that we did to the whales in say the 1920s and 1930s. This was the global hunt was to feed oil for margarine.
Wow.
There's no good reason why we killed the whales, is what I want to say. And in fact, in the 1950s, it was worse, because by the time that the Europeans had largely dropped out of the whale market, and it was the Japanese doing it for tradition, and the Russians were literally doing it in the pursuit of Stalin's 5-year plans. They would render the whales. They wouldn't even be using these things. Right there, it was on a record somewhere, and you did not say no, and so the Russian ships continued. Right, it was an enormous amount of destruction. But when I think it was I'm trying to remember if it was the Norwegians or the Swedes who were the leaders in the whaling industry. So the U.S. at the end, and God, I'm so sorry, but you just have to put up with this story.
No,
at the end of the 1800s, towards the end of the 1800s, the U.S. was the world's whaling nation. We were the superpower, but we ended up having high labor costs because we had a lot of economic growth. Didn't happen elsewhere. So the U.S. economy is great. you have all of these folks who previously would be willing to put up with a whaling ship and now were demanding huge salaries. So the U.S. effectively got out of the whaling business. The Northern Europeans got into it, and for the next couple generations, they led it. And there was a real question once everybody understood that, in fact, the whales were being depleted. This was a limited natural resource. We were going to have to stop. Right? They started to invest in converting their cities and towns that were whaling towns into other industries, and they did it. And it didn't destroy the economy. It was okay, right? They recognized that what they were doing was long-term unsustainable. They made a conscious effort as a society to invest in change, and there really wasn't an economic reckoning. Do you know where I'm going with this story?
I am so impressed because not only are you a mad scientist and all that, you just out podcasted me. That was
Oh,
awesome. That
well,
was good stuff.
this is a story like I again, this was back when I was doing regular blogging, and it was wild that we all knew that we killed the whales and nobody that I would talk to knew why. Right? And that was a story for me to try to go figure out what the heck happened. But there are lessons in that for us because we had peak blubber way before anybody talked about peak oil. And it's a great example of a natural resource that we actually did deplete. But if I go all the way back to your point that actually sinking whales to the bottom of the ocean is an incredible way to store carbon, that's true. And actually fertilizing the ocean to encourage microalgae to grow is a great way to also true. And if I had Viagra for whales, maybe that is what I should be focused on. Like, there are a lot of people out there who are trying to figure out if there are ways to store CO2 in the ocean. I haven't heard anybody say Viagra for whales yet, and maybe they should. There's a huge opportunity there. You can get carbon credits, man. See if you can create. Just get a new bill. Steve Scalisi's now the head of the Speaker of the House. Float him the idea. See if he'll support it.
I actually would want to do it just to say I saved the planet by having whales have sex. I mean, I just think that would be a cool story. I'd get hoodies made up saying that.
I think we could try to raise some money just by selling the hoodies and see if we can't do some experiments and get this thing going.
Perfect. Hey, Seth, this was a ton of fun. What I would love to do at some point, if I haven't totally repulsed you with doing these things, is I'd love to have you back at some point because we didn't even scratch wild technologies. And my sense is you and I could spend an hour talking wild technologies out there. So I'd love to have you back on at some point into the future to do this because this hour has flown by and I really enjoyed it a lot. I appreciate you coming on.
Well, Chuck, I've had a lot of fun too. I would love so this is the stuff that I've done as a writer and a lot of this climate thing. I'm very passionate about it, obviously. The technology is what I do for a living. So I'd be happy to come and talk about that too. And there's a lot of neat opportunities to, again, I'll say it one more time, to make people's lives better by changing the kinds of technology that they use.
That's really cool. I'll even throw this out there. Is there a field trip that could show us a lot of that stuff? Because I'd bring a camera crew and walk around someplace with you hooked up with microphones because I think that'd be cool if there's a convention somewhere or some demo of something.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. I would love that. I personally would like to visit one of these fusion companies, mostly because I want to believe. I don't quite believe yet, but I really want to believe. But there are, man, it would be cool just to even see if folks would allow us to see the inside of a battery manufacturing plant, as an example, right? The scale that we're operating on is sometimes bewildering. When we talk about this, people don't really understand how many square meters of building these things are. And when people talk about direct air capture as a great example, yeah, let's go down to visit Occidental. There's your field trip.
There we go.
What is this? I don't know when they're going to have this thing built, but I have, I do one of the things I do is techno-economic analysis. I got a spreadsheet somewhere on my laptop here that tells me how many square meters of fans that those guys are planning on putting in. And carbon is 0.04% of the air. CO2 is points, and so it's a lot of fans. I mean, like, it's a mind-blowing amount of fans. It is hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're not like little house fans, but they're not that different from little house fans. And I want to see it because I can't wrap my brain around that.
Well, I'm throwing it right out there. Hey, Vicky, Seth and I want to come see it, and we'll shoot content for it. You'll have a traditional oil and gas pro bro on one side and a technologist, environmentalist on the other side, and we'll come see it and check it out.
If Vicky sits down with me, I'm going to have such a hard time talking to my friends. Totally, Vicky, bring it, 100%. I'm there. I want to see. Right. I want to see if these things are real.
Awesome. Well, Seth, how do people find you if somebody wants to reach out? You on LinkedIn, Twitter, any of those spots?
Yeah. Twitter. Is that what it's called anymore? I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, no, there was a period where I thought I was going to be on Twitter, but right now, Seth Miller, easiest way to find me is to look me up on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to talk to anybody. If they're a friend of and listener of Chuck, even better. So please feel free to reach out. I will engage.
You're too kind. Well, again, appreciate you coming on.